The Straw King, Chapter 4. The lion did not let them rest long. Sniffing and growling to himself, he paced around in the grass until he got his bearings, and then he urged the Scarecrow to his feet. The Scarecrow privately hoped his friend would continue to give him a ride, but the lion didn't offer, and the Scarecrow didn't ask. "The forest isn't too far," the lion said as they started walking. "We'll have to take care not to leave a trail, but we should be there within a day of walking." The sun was high in the sky and warm on their backs. The Scarecrow began to feel peevish. Already the horror of the royal army's death was fading, and now all he could think of was getting his precious books back. And the Munchkins too, of course. "Tin is still on the way to the Emerald Palace," he said suddenly. "We have to warn him." The lion shook his head in disbelief. "Of course, I can't believe I didn't think of that. Well, tell him to take cover until we figure out what to do next." "The Winkies might fight for us," the Scarecrow argued. "We should tell him to meet us in the Forest of Beasts." "The Winkies. Fight? I don't think so. And you know Tin is more of a lover than a fighter himself." The lion chuckled at his own joke, and then reared up on his hind legs, bellowing a sequence of guttural roars that sounded like a strange code. He waited for a few minutes and then roared again. Suddenly a huge old crow descended out of the blue sky, landing in front of the lion and cocking its head. Looking at it, the Scarecrow felt a sudden churning where his stomach should be. His straw rattled just a bit, but he settled himself. The lion, all animal instinct, turned to him. "Scare?" The crow wasn't one of the ones the Scarecrow had known when he was tied to a post in the field not that long ago, before he received his gift, but it was a crow all the same. "You owe me a favor, Fleabag," it croaked to the lion. "I'll settle that once and for all after I'm back to the Forest of the Beasts," the lion said silkily. "But I'm afraid I need just one more thing from you." The crow snorted and ruffled its ratty feathers. The Scarecrow wondered if it would be able to take off again. The bird was so ancient, it looked as though it was next to death. It cocked its head at him and cawed in delight. "The King of Oz!" it exclaimed, its beady eyes meeting the Scarecrow's. "I didn't even recognize you, Sirrah. You've come a long way from the cornfields." It bowed in a way that somehow managed to be sarcastic. "I'm not afraid of you," the Scarecrow managed, keeping his voice even. The Scarecrow cackled, flapping its wings in merriment. "No, too clever for that," it shrieked. It laughed so hard it fell over in the dust and had to struggle mightily to right itself. The Scarecrow narrowed his eyes at it. He wasn't in the field anymore. He did not have to stand for this. "Bow before your king," he said firmly, so firmly that Lion glanced at him in surprise. The crow cocked its head to the side, as if considering another comeback. The lion growled at the crow so loudly and with such wind that the crow's feathers shook. The crow complied, touching its beak to the ground. When it rose, the lion gave it instructions, and when the Scarecrow looked at its beady eyes again, the crow looked away first. "You will take a message," the lion said wearily. "Our friend, the Tin Woodman, is journeying to the Emerald Palace, but he must return to the land of the Winkies for now. The palace has been overtaken by an enemy force." At that, the crow looked startled. "But such a thing has never—" "Yes, we know," the Scarecrow interrupted. Seeing the crow bow for him for real had somehow energized him. He could focus again on what was important, keeping Tin safe. "If he goes to the palace unprepared, he'll be riddled with bullets and torn apart for scrap. You have to warn him." The crow eyeballed them both, looking as though it wanted to protest but decided against it. "Very well," it said, flapping its wings vigorously and launching awkwardly into the air. "But I'll never help you again," it shrieked at the lion before it caught an updraft and was gone. The lion looked at the Scarecrow critically. "That was fun, but you know there's no bowing in the battlefield." The Scarecrow looked at him for a moment and answered, "I know." The lion studied him, and the Scarecrow could see a wave of recognition break across its broad face. The lion knew the Scarecrow's history with the crows. "I could have picked another kind of messenger, but time is short," he said, in his gruff voice but gentle. The Scarecrow's brain was expanding faster and faster every day, so much so that he sometimes worries he'd outgrow his dear friend. But in moments like this, he knew that the lion and Tin and Dorothy would always understand him no matter what. The Scarecrow shook his head. Crows are effective messengers, and like you said, time is short. Still, it's a nasty thing, the lion said under his breath. Ruling of the beasts is a real chore sometimes. They're not like your munchkins. They don't sing and work the day away. They devour it. Every moment is a challenge. Anyway, he added in a normal tone, the message will tell him to take cover. We might be able to rally the beasts to your cause. It's your cause, too, the Scarecrow pointed out. I'm supposed to be your king. Of course you are, old friend. I just wanted to make sure it's what you wanted. Why would you say that? I know your brain is up to the task, Scare, but the way Oz is going, you're going to end up with some blood on that shiny new uniform of yours. Oz is changing, but do you want it to change you? It was Scare's turn not to answer, at least not out loud. He needed time to think, to do more research, but he knew one thing. He was going to rule Oz intelligently. He was going to create a world where the mind was valued above all else. He'd go down in history as the cleverest king Oz has ever had. He took a deep breath and looked at his friend. Lion, I want to be kind more than anything, and I want to educate all of Oz. The lion looked at him at a long beat, his tail standing on end, like it did when he was figuring something out. You mean like have everyone go to school? Exactly, he cried. That's either the dumbest or the most brilliant thing I've ever heard, the lion said with a laugh, and began moving again. Scarecrow felt a spring in his step after that. Saying it out loud had given him more energy, but Lion's earlier assertion still haunted him a bit. His sawdust-stuffed brain struggled to process anything that had happened. Maybe the lion was right. While Scare had been shut in his books, Oz was changing. If that were the case, he'd have to find a way to keep up. But how could he fight off an entire army of invaders? There was no way he could retake the castle by himself. He'd have to think of a way to get the lion to help him, maybe even all the beasts. And that was going to take more craftiness than he'd ever used in his life. The Scarecrow smiled grimly to himself. If Oz itself was changing, so could he. Looking at the landscape, Scare realized hadn't been on a real adventure since Dorothy had landed in Oz, rescued him from the field where she'd found him, and swept him up in her quest to find the wizard. He owed everything he was now to that girl and her funny dog. He wondered absently where she was now. Back in the other place, he supposed. If only he had a way to send her some kind of message, to tell her what had happened in the palace. The Scarecrow's new brain had been helpful when he was the king of Oz, but he secretly had to admit that he wasn't entirely sure it was up to snuff when it came to totally new situations, like a coup and an invading army. But Dorothy would have known how to deal with Ginger. He was sure of it. She'd figure out a solution to all the problems they'd faced before. Dorothy was the reason he had come up with the idea of education. She told him about her schools back home. Apparently, the very young went there and learned about the world. If Oz had one of those, maybe Ginger wouldn't be so ignorant, and this whole mess wouldn't be happening. He sighed. He wished he could bounce his current predicament off Dorothy. It didn't matter. He had no way of reaching her, and he would have to deal with this strange new situation himself. He had already come a long way from that sad stuffed creature languishing away in the cornfield. He had helped Dorothy defeat the wizard, gotten his brain, and become the King of Oz. Surely he could manage the coming conflict without the help of a child from another world. The lion would have been ashamed of him if he'd spoken any doubts aloud. He stood up straighter as he walked, determined to turn over a new leaf, but hoofbeats in the path behind him caused him to turn. Get under cover, the lion growled, pushing him towards a row of bushes. Now! The Scarecrow dove behind a bush, with the lion close behind him, as the mysterious rider thundered toward them. They peered through the branches as the horse galloped past. Its haunches were smeared with blood and gore, and its rider was in even worse shape, barely clinging to its dirt-clumped mane. The horse was moving so quickly that it was difficult to make out the rider's features, but the Scarecrow was certain it was a munchkin, and it looked absolutely terrified. "Wasn't that one of the palace horses?" the lion asked. "And I think that's one of the palace servants," the Scarecrow said, nodding. The lion frowned. Perhaps he or she was just fleeing the battle. The Scarecrow felt its brain stir. almost as if he were revving a motor. "The battle is over," he said decisively. "It was over as soon as the royal army was killed and we left the palace. We've been walking for a while. This is something else." The lion nodded thoughtfully. "If we see another rider, we should stop him and ask. As long as it's not one of Ginger's soldiers." "I'd rather not be captured by the likes of them," the Scarecrow said with a shudder. Scarecrow heard a strange whooshing sound, and then he and Lion continued. All they found were more trees. As they pressed forward, Scare felt a few drops of rain landing on his lapel. He looked down as another drop landed on his hand. It wasn't rain, it was dark red. It was blood. "Lion?" he said in a whisper. He looked up. Above him, a Munchkin was caught in some kind of elaborate web. The web was cutting into her skin, drawing drops of blood. A little voice cried, "Help me."